Welcome to our evening session. I trust you enjoyed all our thematic tracks this afternoon and were able to see something of the excellent EFAT exhibition. Now, the theme of this evening's session is towards the 2030 goals, making the decade count, which the more observant of you will have noticed is the theme of the entire summit. So to discuss this, we're going to have a fascinating conversation between three giants of the field, between Mr. Jairam Ramesh, the Hon'ble Member of Parliament, and so much more besides, Lord Adair Turner, Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission, and Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General of TERI. So please join me in welcoming our conversationalists. And Dr. Mathur, over to you.
Well, first of all, a very warm welcome both to Mr. Jairam Ramesh and to Lord Adair Turner as we look at the decade ahead. As you all know, Mr. Jairam Ramesh has led from the front as the Minister for Environment and later on as Minister for Rural Development, Drinking Water, etc. But most recently, I've greatly admired his biographies, both of Mrs. Gandhi and more recently of Krishna Menon. Welcome.
Thank you.
Lord Adair Turner, who we are delighted to have with us, is the chairman of the Energy Transitions Commission as well as of the Institute for the New Economy. He is a former head of the UK Climate Committee and of the UK Financial Services Authority. In between them, we have what it takes to provide us answers on the move ahead. So the first question that comes to my mind is, do we need to do anything? Would the 2030 goals, whether they're the Sustainable Development Goals or the climate goals, happen by themselves? Or is there a large effort that is needed? So could I start with you by asking, what is it? Why are we even talking of these goals?
Well, I think we announced a set of goals in Paris, and the least we can do is to stick to those goals. Unfortunately, what should have been done in Paris and soon thereafter is to set up a system of accountability which puts pressure on countries to ensure that these goals are actually fulfilled. We are still a long way from achieving that system. However, let's take the countries at their face value and make sure that at least the goals, modest as they are, that were announced in 2015, actually get achieved by 2025 or 2030. I know there is a great desire for increasing the level of ambition. I know there's a great desire that we should be bolder. Without getting into without that issue, well, I'm sure that there are countries where bolder action can take place. I think the least countries like India can do, China, India particularly, can do is to ensure that the commitments that they have made are fulfilled, and the world has the confidence that they are fulfilled.
Right.
I think that's more important. I mean, the fact that they get fulfilled, I mean, we can always report that they are fulfilled. I think the important thing comes from a system of accountability and transparency, which ensures that these goals are actually being fulfilled before we take on a fresh round of commitments, which I think we are bound to take in a couple of years from now.
So, are we bound to take the commitments?
Well, I think we're going to have to make new commitments as well as delivered ones that we've done. And I think, thinking about the next decade, it's useful to start by just casting our eye over what's happened in the last decade. In 2010, concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were 390, which was already way above the 100 to 280 range which had applied throughout the entire million years of human history, which is the entire human history. And since 2010, they've gone up from 390 to 411, which is a faster pace of increase than any previous decade. Inevitably, temperatures have gone up. The 2010s saw temperatures 0.2 degrees on average across the world, higher than the 2000s, and 8 of the 10 hottest years on record were in the 2010s. And we ended the decade with, in May and June, here in the subcontinent, in both India and Pakistan, extraordinary heat waves, temperatures above 50 degrees centigrade, severe droughts, tens of thousands of deaths from premature deaths from heat. We've seen the Australian bushfires. We've seen catastrophic floods in Indonesia. And if you look at what the models tell us, right at the moment, given the path we're on, and even given the commitments which were made, both the Paris Climate Agreement, we are on path to warm the world by 3 degrees centigrade by 2100, which I think will have a severe, very severe impact on human welfare without the world, and in some regions, absolutely catastrophic impact. And I think that's probably true in India more than anywhere else in the world. I think India is probably one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change. So I do think we've actually got to say, we have got to turn this corner, and we've only got a decade left. I mean, if we're sitting here in 10 years' time, and we're still saying, well, we're going to fix it, but we're not clearly on a trend to do it, then we've lost. Then it's game over, and we are headed to a catastrophe. So we do absolutely have to deliver the commitments we've made, some of which were made at Paris, some of which various countries have tightened since then, and I'd like to come back to what is the nature of the commitments being made. But I think we also all have to find a way to strengthen them, and I think we've got to end up aiming for net zero emissions across the world by about 2050 or 2060.
That's not happening, is it?
It won't happen.
Countries are
It won't
moving
happen.
away
It won't
rather
happen.
than towards it.
It won't happen.
So why is it not happening?
It won't happen because the one lesson that we learn from decades of climate change negotiations is commitments can never be top-down. Commitments have necessarily, the political economy of commitments is bottom-up. So it has to be commitments that countries feel comfortable with, which is dictated by their domestic political economy considerations.
And
So-
domestic political economy considerations in many, many countries are not focusing on climate.
The domestic political economy considerations in most countries will necessarily focus on economic growth, will necessarily focus on faster urbanization, will necessarily focus on faster industrialization.
So is there a chance for them to piggyback on each other?
Well, I think there is a chance for leapfrogging, and I think what we're all hoping for is the technological discontinuities which has disrupted the telecommunication system, for example. If there is a technological discontinuity which completely disrupts the storage of energy, for example. Giving you an example, if you have a mobile telephony type of revolution in energy storage, then much of what we are doing becomes a reality by the middle of the coming decade. So I think we necessarily have to keep our eyes on evolving technologies, but I think there's also a tremendous need for making the right choices. And one of the advantages of being a latecomer, and most developing countries, including India, are latecomers to the high growth league, is that you can actually make these choices. You can make these choices in transport, you can make these choices in industry, you can make these choices in the buildings that we build. So I think these choices have to be made, and we don't necessarily have to follow the same grow now, pay later model, which was pioneered by the US and Western Europe, which then got followed by China, and which also was adopted by India. But I think India, amongst all these countries, certainly speaking for India, which I know better than the other countries, speaking for India, there are still today opportunities for making these choices. Because almost 75% of the infrastructure that we need for the year 2030 or 2040 remains
yet to be built.
So it's how you build this infrastructure that is going to be crucial.
So is it technologically possible to move towards the zero carbon by mid-century?
Yes, it absolutely is. I mean, let me begin by saying, just to clarify, I'm not suggesting that the world should declare everybody has to be on a target of 2050, 2060. I think it has to be bottom up, but it needs to be informed by the science of what we want. And broadly speaking, I do think we need all the developed countries in the world to be committing to be zero by 2050 and developing not long after. I would say 2060 is a reasonable thing. I think that's what we have to aim for if we're serious. The good news is many countries are making that commitment. Essentially, all European countries are now heading towards a net zero by 2050 commitment. I'm absolutely confident all Scandinavians will get there earlier. The UK is now legally committed to do that. We are working out the plans to get there, and I think we will get there. And I think we'll get there because it is technologically possible. And it's technologically possible because alongside the rather worrying things that have happened in the last decade has also seen extraordinary technological breakthroughs, with the cost of solar power coming down by 90%, wind power coming down by 75%, batteries coming down by 85%. And all of those enable us far more clearly than in 2010 to describe what a zero-carbon economy will be. A zero-carbon economy will be a deeply electrified economy in which electricity accounts for 65 or 70% of total final energy demand versus 20% today, and in which all of that extra electricity is delivered in a green fashion by renewables, maybe nuclear as well, and we do have the solutions to the storage mechanisms, the balancing. And I think we should be confident that those are available. And I think just to pick up this issue about leapfrogging, I think this is really important for India. So our work in ETC India suggests that India, which now produces and consumes 1,100 terawatt hours a day, should be consuming, by 2050, 6,000 or 7,000 terawatt hours. Because the aim here is to grow prosperity. It's not to go into a sort of puritanical denial of growth. It's to grow prosperity. But the good news is that when you're growing an electricity system to deliver 6,500, 7,000 terawatt hours in 2050, and you're only generating 1,100 terawatt hours today, 85% of it is going to have to be new.
The point
so
that,
all we have to do is make sure that all of that new growth is the new green form. And it's similar in the steel industry. I was with the ETC India team yesterday looking at the projections of growth of Indian steel production from, I think it's about 130 million tons today to maybe as much as 390 million tons by 2050. But all of that is new capacity. And one can build that new capacity in a zero-carbon fashion, or in a fashion which can easily be made zero-carbon. And that's actually a much easier transition than starting with a whole load of blast furnaces and saying, I'm going to have to throw them away to get to zero-carbon. So the technologies make me very, very confident that we know how to build zero-carbon economies that deliver Western European developed economy standards of living. And that's the vision that we have to have. We know how to have rich developed standards of living which are zero carbon. And the whole of Europe will be there by 2050. In 2050, we will be in Europe looking at developed rich countries which are net zero in their emissions. And we should be clear that that's technologically possible.
So what are the kinds of political choices that we would make in India and not in Western Europe, but say in the United States?
Well, clearly, without the US coming on board and being part of this global system, we are not going to be reaching the objectives that Lord Turner is talking about. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that Europe is going to achieve its target. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that both as a collective as well as individual countries, the Europeans are going to be very much the leaders in this area. I'm not so sure about the Americans. I think with the increasing prospect of Mr. Trump being re-elected, the probability of the United States being out of the Paris framework is getting brighter, right? So if he doesn't get elected, maybe the US may rejoin Paris, but that's a fond hope increasingly. But the US is not going to make these types of choices, even though individual states in the United States, and even though individual cities in the United States making these choices, I think as a system, the US system, the transportation system and the urbanization system is not going to be able to deliver the type of objectives that Lord Turner is talking about. On the other hand, I think therefore there's a special responsibility on India and China.
Yeah.
I mean, they are going to be crucial in terms of the net additions over the next 10 to 15 years. India particularly, the Chinese have already become the world leader in this emissions game. And India, if things go as they are, by 2030, will occupy the second spot after China, where the US is now. So these choices, whether it's in the design, the re-architecturing of the electricity system, see, it's not just the generation of electricity, it's the transmission of electricity, it's the distribution of electricity. One of the great lessons we learned from Germany, the energy window of Germany, which has resulted in today over 1/3 of electricity supply daily in Germany is based on renewables. One of the great lessons we learned is not just rooftop solar, it's the reconfiguration of the entire electricity grid that has resulted in this major transformation. So transformations are not just in terms of individual technologies, but it's the transformation of the system. It's the generation, transmission, distribution system. And use. Yeah. Similarly, urbanization, it's how you plan your cities, how you plan your buildings. So these are the choices. In agriculture, our choices are much more difficult, okay? Much more difficult in agriculture, we can talk about that later. But in industry, certainly in transportation, and certainly in the commercial sector, these choices have to be made and can be made because the incremental investment which we need for 2030 and 2040, it remains to be made. See, one of the great advantages of Europe is in a state of demographic decline, right? But India is going to continue to be in a state of demographic expansion for the next 40, 50 years. In fact, even China begins to decline demographically by the middle of this decade, by 2025. India, on the other hand, is going to continue to increase its population. That has its adverse consequences. But one positive side of that is the infrastructure required for that will have to be built. And you don't have to repeat the infrastructure that you have built in the past. You can build new infrastructure. I think that's the great opportunity for a country like India.
Everything that I hear tells me that the zero carbon infrastructure would be more expensive as a first cost.
Yes.
Though a lifetime cost will be less.
Yes.
Will that beggar us?
No, it won't. I think, we have done, enough studies have been shown which have demonstrated that this is not an intolerable burden that is going to be put on the exchequer. You end up, your GDP may decline by 0.1 or 0.2 percentage points, but when it's declining by 2.5 percentage points, what is 0.1 or 0.2 percentage points? And I think a country that is growing the way India is, and with the availability of financial resources, innovative financial resources, we can find the resources on our own. And you see, that was the problem with the traditional Indian approach that I had before I became environment minister. The traditional Indian approach is that we will adjust provided we get technology and we get finance. I mean, that's a crappy approach to take because you have the ability to develop the technology, you have the ability to mobilize the resources, you go out and do it. And you can do it, it's not as if you can't do it. I think this is an opportunity for us. It's beginning to happen in renewables. It's beginning to happen in solar, certainly. I think the ambitious target we set for ourselves. It's not happening in transport. It's unfortunately not happening. I mean, it would happen once the EV revolution becomes scale. It's a small intervention once it becomes a scale intervention. But I think the big news really is on renewables. However, I want to caution that transition is not just renewables, because today, based on today's technology, you still require, for 1 gigawatt of renewables you require at least 1 gigawatt of nuclear.
So,
in fact, I would take the position, crucial to India's transition is how quickly we are going to bring nuclear capacity on stream. This is not a popular. This is not popular amongst environmentalists.
Electricity distribution companies tell us nuclear electricity costs 5 rupees a kilowatt hour.
Yeah.
Why on earth would I buy it when I get coal electricity
Well, you know,
at 3.5 rupees?
if I need base load capacity and if I have a choice between nuclear and coal, I would rather go with nuclear than coal. Because the full cost of coal is never factored in our planning. That's why coal is, you know, priced today at 5 rupees, 5.5
So
rupees.
does this mean that the regulator will need to say that there is an effective carbon price?
I think we have a carbon price of sorts, but I think, yes, an explicitly mandated carbon price would be a signaling effect on economic agents. Absolutely.
So what do we see about carbon price in Europe?
Well, can I come back to, I just wanted to pick up one point. I'm absolutely not against nuclear, and I think it makes sense to, in a system, have a certain amount of nuclear. But I think it is also important to realize that we are increasingly confident that we can run systems which are as much as 80% dependent on variable renewables. I mean, Spain is on a clear path to have zero carbon renewables, 75% of its power system in 2030. It's not developing nuclear, and I'm confident that when you go to Madrid in 2030...
But Spain is part of a regional
It is, yeah, but across the whole of Europe.
It's not an independent
No, but
country.
across the whole of Europe.
But then you have this huge Norway battery
the battery, that it is useful when you have it, it varies by it, but I think the idea that you need half, that you can only take, you know, renewables to 40% or 50%, I think that's wrong.
You can take much more.
You can go much more than that. But to go back to the carbon price, well, I want to just comment on the point you said about what are the costs earlier. I do think it's important for us to realize that there are many areas of the economy where the technology will get so good that the transition will be costless. It will be zero cost, even negative cost. And there are some where getting to zero will cost us something, but it's very, very small as a percent of our economy. Let me give you some examples. I think that eventually we will be getting our electricity from renewables cheaper than we do today from fossil fuels. The electricity system, we're going to get cheaper electricity by the second half of this century. I think we will all pay much less for our surface transport, our road transport, than we do today, because I think within about 5 or 6 years, buying an electric car up front is going to be cheaper than buying an internal combustion engine car, because apart from the battery, everything else about an electric car is inherently cheaper because it's such a simpler thing to make than an internal combustion engine car. So we have some sectors of the economy where eventually we're going to be better off, even in narrow economic terms, by getting to a zero-carbon economy. We then have other sectors, and this will bring me to the carbon price, where I do think decarbonization will cost us something. The entire European steel industry is now making a commitment to be zero carbon by 2050. ArcelorMittal have said that, ThyssenKrupp have said that, SSAB, Salzgitter, Vollstaupen, and indeed Tata in Europe. Because we know the technologies that can get us there by putting carbon capture and storage on blast furnaces or by going down a hydrogen direct reduction route. But our best estimates at the moment is that this will cost, right? Obviously, if you take an existing procedure and add CCS to it, by definition, it has to cost. That can't be cheaper. The hydrogen route might get cheaper if renewables are incredibly cheap, but in all likelihood, it will mean that the cost of producing a ton of steel might be another $80 a ton on top of $400 or $500 to produce a ton of steel. And you say, oh, God, for the company, that's a 25% extra cost of production. Work out what that means for what somebody is going to pay for a car made out of zero-carbon steel rather than high-carbon steel, and they will not even notice the difference, right? Because there's about a ton or 3/4 of a ton of steel in a typical car, and so that's going to be $80 on the cost of a car, which was otherwise going to cost $15,000. You won't even notice the cost down at that level, but you will if you are a steel producer who's gone zero carbon, and the guy next door isn't. So these commitments that the European steel industry are now making to zero carbon are contingent. And they are contingent on Europe introducing a serious carbon price within Europe, and with Europe introducing a border carbon tariff against imports of steel from any country which is not also imposing a similar carbon price. And I have to say that I think this train has left the station, and that within 5 years' time, I think Europe, and I include in this the UK, outside Europe, but we'll find a cooperative stance as well. I think the European Union, the whole of Europe, is going to head to serious carbon pricing across our industrial sector, but with border tariffs against any country which doesn't also impose a carbon price. Though the aim of it is not to be protectionists, it's to say to the rest of the world, please also impose a similar carbon price. Now, what I would say is, whatever you think of whether that's a good thing or not, and on the whole I think it's a good thing, recognize that this is now almost certain to happen. I cannot see, so SSAB, Swedish company, has made, to reduce its 10 million tons of steel, it has basically said it is closing its last blast furnace in 2042. Its first one's going to close in 2026. It's going down the hydrogen direct reduction route, but it has said to the Swedish government, your choice now, we will be a zero carbon steel producer in 2042, but we can be a zero carbon steel producer of 10 million tons if you give us a carbon price and protection. Otherwise, we'll be a zero carbon producer of 0 tons.
Right.
But each way, they're quite clear they're not going to be a high carbon producer. So that is the dynamics which is going on, I think, in the European steel industry today.
On this, can I turn to you and look at the Indian experience? Will we go the carbon tax way, or do you think we'll go the regulation way, or both?
Well, we had a carbon tax. You know, we had a partial carbon tax. You know,
The tax on coal sales.
We had a tax on coal, which got sort of hijacked. It'll come back on
the
stream,
GST compensation.
Come back on stream. So I think the notion of a carbon tax is not alien to our thinking. So we've had a partial carbon tax, and I'm sure if push comes to shove, we can introduce across the board, economy-wide carbon tax. There will be a mix of tax and regulation. I think it'll be not an either-or situation. But I just want to get back to one point that he made and provoke him a little. If he wants meaningful action on the global stage, if you're talking about border taxes, forget it. The end of chapter. No conversation.
But why is that? Why? Because this...
It's a non-tariff barrier. You're violating WTO rules.
But how else
Moment
is the,
you
how
start
else is the,
talking
Euro,
of border
how else
taxes,
is the European
I
steel
have no
industry to
problem
get
with
to
the
zero?
European country saying zero carbon. But moment the European country says, I'm not going to import steel from a country which is not subscribing to this, that's a non-tariff.
Well, we've got to have a debate about this, because Europe wants
we have an economist sitting here.
Europe wants to decarbonize. There are a whole set of ways in which it can decarbonize, even if the rest of the world doesn't. It can decarbonize its power systems, its surface transport, its residential heating. There's a whole load of stuff where it doesn't matter. When it gets to an internationally traded commodity, the choice is either Europe doesn't decarbonize, or it finds some way of having some protection. Now, the ideal is to agree a carbon price simultaneously across the world.
Some kind
but
of
but if the rest of the world won't agree, what is the disadvantage to the rest of the world?
I agree with you on that. But if you were to do this selectively, you run foul, you have a good, bad, indifferent, you have an international trading regime. And imposing border taxes based on carbon content runs foul of that regime. Now, if the Europeans are saying we don't want WTO, that's a different matter.
Yeah.
But you can't say I'm committed to WTO, I want to strengthen fair trade, I want to strengthen free trade,
should we
and
bring
then
in,
say
should
I
we
want to
bring in
impose border tax.
certification?
Oh, sorry?
Should we bring in certification of green steel, so that if I'm a user, I say I want green steel, I want certified green
By the way, that certification exists in a lot of agricultural commodities. It already exists.
No, it
When
works on
India
many
exports, you get certification is certainly one way of doing it. Certainly one way of doing it. But border tax of the type that the Lord is talking about, I think that's going to be a counterproductive.
Well, here's what I would like. I would like India and Europe together to agree a carbon price on industry and jointly to oppose border taxes against any country, such as America, which, unlike us, is not taking zero carbon seriously. Now, why can't we do that? Well, why not? Why not? We have an American president who does a lot of stuff which we don't like on trade, that you don't like on trade, that we don't like on trade. Why don't we now unite to do something good for the world in terms of zero carbon?
Will China be part of that system?
What?
Will China be part of the system?
That is I spend a lot of time in China, and this is exactly what I'm talking to them about.
That's the crux.
Yeah.
You won't find, it won't be traumatic for India, but it'll be traumatic for China.
No.
You know?
Yes and no. If you start with an environment where Europe has no carbon price at all on its steel producers, and move to one where it has a carbon price in its steel producers, but also a carbon price at the border, the relative position of a Chinese exporter to Europe is exactly before you did both of those things. So it's
any
no
case,
different.
our problem-
It doesn't change.
Our problem is being solved, Lord
It
Turner.
doesn't change it.
You know,
Anyway, but
Europe
this is a
no
debate
longer
which
our
is going
most
to happen.
important trading partner. We are exporting to Southeast Asia. So we don't have to worry about border taxes in Europe.
So this then leads to the issue, what does it take to get the US on board?
That's a bigger question. That's a bigger question. See, there are parts of the US which are on board.
How do we get those parts on board?
The states are on board, the cities are on board, the companies are on board. And
So
they're
does the
aggressively-
UNFCCC need to be expanded to give a place to companies and
No.
states?
It has to be, it's an intergovernmental agreement. It has to be a governmental agreement. Problem is, yes, okay, maybe we are overestimating the power of the US federal government. If 7 large emitters in the US system, states and cities, are on board, if the big emitters from a corporate point of view are on board, then the US is on board. One can take that argument. One can overdo this US is not part of Paris because there are large segments of the US which are committed to the Paris Agreement. Maybe not in the numbers, but
at least as far as the direction
the
is concerned.
trajectory. And I think that's an important gain. That's a very important gain. So, whether
But do you think we
formally
can get
the
ahead?
US
I mean,
on board,
I remember a conversation with you in which you said, in 2100, we will be carbon free. The issue is, can we be carbon free in 2050?
Yeah.
Can we be carbon free 2050 without the US being on board?
The answer is maybe not. I mean, let me be honest. I spend a lot of my time trying to be optimistic, but then I've got to work out what are my meal probabilities. And I remember there was a statement from Gramsci. Gramsci said you should be pessimistic of the intellect, but optimistic of the spirit. You should absolutely rigorously work out what your probabilities of success are, and then work to make them higher. If I'm absolutely truthful, if you asked me, could we build a zero carbon economy even by 2050? If I knew that aliens were plotting to come to Earth and remove all our fossil fuels at the end of December the 31st, 2049, if we knew that, would we build a zero carbon economy? Yes. 100% absolutely certain we would do it, we could technologically do it, and we would not notice the difference to our growth rates and our standards of living. It is doable. I think the chances of us actually doing a zero carbon economy in time to stop potentially really catastrophic climate change are about 30%. I think there's about a 70% chance that this generation or this generation and maybe one below is handing on to the generation 2 below us an absolute catastrophe, and that we're failed and we're the pathetic generation. That's honestly what in my heart of heart I believe. I think we've got an only 30% chance of success. We've got to make it higher. Now, to turn to America, I sometimes try to convince myself that America not being in Paris is okay, because California, New York, Microsoft, Google, fantastic technologies, actually coal-fired power stations have closed at a faster rate over the last 2 years in America than in the previous period, despite the fact that Trump digs coal. He isn't digging so much of it these days, apparently. But yes, there's a lot that can make you optimistic, but you can't deny that having the biggest economy in the world and this huge superpower pulling out of Paris, it's a tragedy. It sets back the probabilities of success. It's deeply irresponsible. It's deeply regrettable. And if I could return to something that Mr. Ramesh said earlier, I think that just makes India and China more important. You know, I think Europe is committed to do it. There is a political consensus in Europe for a particular set of circumstances. And we have got to, as much as possible, create an alliance of action between Europe, China, and India, and all of the non-federal players in the US, And that's our best chance of increasing those probabilities of success. But let's be clear, we're not on track at the moment, and we've got a hell of a lot of work to get anywhere near on track.
Geopolitically, is an India, EU-China alliance realistic?
No, I don't think so. I think, these alliances have, for example, at Copenhagen, it made sense for Brazil, South Africa, India, and China to come together. The Europeans were very unhappy because BASIC negotiated with the Americans directly, bypassing the Europeans. But that had relevance, but today it has no relevance. I mean, how can India be part of an alliance in which one of the members of the alliance, the stated objective is to destroy the Amazon? I mean, there's a fundamental contradiction in our approach. So, I mean, I don't see BASIC today having the same importance, for example. So, I think even India and China, when we were part of BASIC, we recognized that there were differences, but we were united in ensuring, what united us was a common objective in avoiding top-down commitments imposed on us of the Kyoto variety, which were at that point of time a real possibility, right? But we have moved on. We have taken commitments, the discourse has changed, the consensus is now much more in favor of taking on responsibilities, although voluntary, not as part of a global system, and responsibilities which we take ownership of, not as part of an international system of reporting. So I think this system, it's a loose system, I agree. But this is the system that is political. Ultimately, see, when Lord Turner says, science has told us, I mean, I react very negatively to that. What is science?
I thought you were a scientist.
No. Ultimately, it's politics. Ultimately, science does what politics allows it to do. Scientists are not independent players. Scientists are not value-free players. Okay? Science told us Himalayan glaciers were going to vanish by 2035. But that science was shown to be a fraud. Frankly. You know the whole debate about the retreat of the Himalayan glaciers. It was shown to be, science also has a lot of political objectives here. So, it's not as if science is an independent player. Science is very important. We learn lessons from science. We have good examples where science has dictated political action. And the ozone layer is a very good example of that. But ultimately, these are political choices that countries make. They're not scientific choices. The transportation system, the pattern of urbanization, the degree of industrialization, these are political choices that countries make based on economic considerations. Now, I agree with you that today the new factor is we have to factor in our ultimate objective of being zero carbon. That was not there 10 years ago.
No, it was not there.
That was huge change.
Yeah.
That's a huge change. And sooner we internalize this, the better off we are. I agree with him 100%.
Yeah. So, I do think the other thing which I think has beneficially happened, and it's really moved on in the last 3 or 4 years, is the internalization of net zero. I mean, even in the UK, I was the first chair, as you mentioned earlier, of the UK Climate Change Committee. And we were very proud that in 2006, we passed an act that said we would reduce our emissions by 60% below 1990 levels by 2050. One of the first acts of my committee as chair was to recommend to the government that we increased that target to an 80% reduction. But it was only last July that we turned that into a 100% reduction, because that is reflecting just an increasing awareness of what we have to do to avoid potentially catastrophic climate change. And that is now being reflected in major corporates doing the same. So the largest container shipping company in the world, Maersk, saying it will get to zero carbon. I think we are creating a useful language in two respects. First, a technological certainty that we can get to net zero. And secondly, that it is a language of debate about where we get there. Now, different countries will get there at a different time, but by creating a debate that says Sweden and Norway will be there by 2040 because it's easy for them because they've got all that hydro. UK will get there by 2050, a bit more difficult, but we'll get there. Other countries may be later, but we need that, an emerging, voluntarily developed idea of when we get to net zero and then we can work out whether the totality of that looks good enough in terms of the climate impact.
So the key issue that we have seen over the last 10 years is the internalization
Absolutely.
of climate into our actions. I see it nowhere better than in the emission gap reports produced by the United Nations Environment Program. If you look at the emissions gap report of the early 2000s, the first ones, they said that the emissions in 2030 would be something of the order of 64 gigatons of CO2. Now, they say it will be about 52. Now, to be even remain at 2 degrees centigrade, we need about 40. So there's a 11 gigatons gap. But we moved from 64 to 52. The Kyoto Protocol was a failure. Paris has yet to come into force. I think it happened because of this internalization. I think the annual COPs happened. And therefore, it's very much like asking whether this glass is half full or half empty. I just think the question is wrong. I think this glass is too big for the job. I want to thank both of you for this absolutely delightful conversation, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
One point, Ajay.
Oh.
You know, in 2010, when I said at Cancun that all countries must take on responsibilities. You remember?
Yeah.
What a huge outcry there was in this country, in Parliament. I had sold the country down. This is part of some plot to keep India perennially poor. I have exceeded my brief and so on. But today,
Yeah, everybody.
everybody knows we have to do this. That's the change that has come about. And I think one of the reasons why this has come about is, frankly, this may not be causation, this may be correlation. The frequency of natural disasters in the last 10 years has been far more frequent than in the previous 40 years that I can remember. And that's why what was considered to be a revolutionary position in 2010, in 2020 is par for the course. I think that's the big change that has come about in the discourse.
I hope that the next 10 years will tell us we have actually turned the course of carbon emissions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Adair, absolutely marvelous. But we know that we are running out of time. And so here is something for us to make sure. Absolutely. So turn it over and make sure that it runs.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.